Everyone. My name is Kavitha Bindra. I'm the Managing Director for Alumni Relations here at the Yale School of Management. I'm also a proud member of the class of 2005. I just also wanted to say good morning to our alumni and classmates who are joining us from Asia. I understand there's a watch party in Beijing happening now, so thank you for joining us as well. I wanted to welcome you all to our first Yale SOM Exchange event. While the school has sponsored a variety of webinars which our faculty have conducted, often involving panels of alumni providing expertise on various topics. This is the first in our series called Yale SOM Exchange, which really allows us to delve deeper into faculty research and really bring that to the SOM community. So thank you for joining us for this inaugural event. I'm thrilled to introduce Sharon Oster, the Frederick D. Wolf Professor of Management and Entrepreneurship here at the Yale School of Management. I know I am not speaking just for myself when I say that Professor Oster has been a transformative part of many of our lives. And I know some of the words that you spoke to my class when we graduated still resonate with me and have guided me through my career. So it's a great honor to introduce you tonight. Just a few words about Professor Oster. She's a beloved member of our community. She served as the dean of the school from 2008 to 2011. She's a specialist in competitive strategy, microeconomic theory, industrial organization, the economics of regulation and antitrust, and nonprofit strategy. So tonight, Professor Oster will be speaking about nonprofit expansion and replication. We'll be taking questions from the audience at the end of the talk. If you are listening at home or at a watch party in Beijing, you can submit questions online using the Zoom platform or on social media using the hashtag Yale SOM Exchange. For those here in person, there will be a reception directly after the talk. And on behalf of the entire Yale SOM alumni community, Professor Oster, thank you again for doing this.
Thank you, Kavitha. So let me add my welcome to my former students, and both in the room and outside of the room. Now, most of you know that the standard way I run a class is to cold call on people. But I will not do that tonight because I don't think it works well in the particular setting. So I'll save my questions when you ask your questions at the end. So I'm talking today, assuming this works. All right. Do we have an IT person? So maybe I will talk, and you can find an IT person who's going to make this work. So I'm going to talk today about expansion and replication in the nonprofit sector. And we're going to explore questions like, why should nonprofits grow? What drives growth? And how they should grow. And I find when I talk on this topic, the idea that you should ever think that you shouldn't grow seems quite an unusual thought to many people in the nonprofit sector, in the for-profit sector as well. There's a sense that we grow as people, our children grow, we grow, some fatter, some taller, and that somehow organizations should grow too. But I hope one of the things that will happen today, you'll come away with a feeling that growing is a decision, or should be a decision, like many other decisions. And there are some times in which, as you run an organization or as you're on the board of an organization, there'll be a moment in which you say, why are we doing this? Maybe this is not the right thing for us to do. Thank you. Okay, so let's just get started with a few examples of the kind of growth we see nonprofits engaged in. You take, and I have a bunch of examples here ranging from Human Rights Watch, which began actually looking at abuses of human rights in Eastern Europe, and then expanded over the years to dealing with human rights abuses throughout the world and had offices across the world. Our own graduate, Todd, took the Roundabout Theater, which he took over in the early 80s as one little organization he always claimed at the time the only reason they'd let him take it over as a young graduate of both the drama school and our school was that they were very close to the edge of bankruptcy. And my guess is for many people who are given the opportunity to run something that seems a little elevated for them, that if when you look at it again, you'll discover one of the reasons you've been allowed to do something is it wasn't in very good financial shape. But now, of course, Roundabout has 5 different theaters throughout New York. Planned Parenthood, 52 affiliates. Cleveland Clinic isn't just in Cleveland, it's really around the country and around the world. Lincoln Center has a range of, it's all in one place, but it's broadened the range of what it does. So you can think of growth as having both a scale issue and a scope issue. So Planned Parenthood has grown with scale from 1 to many organizations. Lincoln Center grew in a scope way. And I want to think a little bit about both scale and scope kinds of additions. So I categorize the question about why people grow, why an organization grows, into 3 buckets: demand side, cost side, and then the one that turns out to be perhaps the least appropriate but the largest bucket of all, and that is the personal side. So on the demand side, and I'm hoping this resonates with those of you who have thought about growing an organization, if you ask the founder of something, why is it you've grown? Why is it you've decided to put another site for your organization? Why is it, you run New Haven Reads, for example, and you decide to put in a second or a third site for your operation. You run Planned Parenthood, you decide to put in a 50th or a 51st set of affiliates in your organization. The first answer most people have is, I'm doing great work here, but I could do more great work, and if I have another site, or if I add 3 rooms to this site, I'll be able to serve twice as many people. And so, and notice, there's usually a second sentence that says, moreover, there's nobody else out there who can do it, or really, who can do it as well as I can do it. So there's the demand is limitless, and therefore I'm going to create more supply to do this operation. A second, and that usually gives me scale. That's a scale move typically. I'm doing this particular thing well, I should do even more of it. We also hear some similar kinds of things in scope expansion. So a scope expansion just says, I'm currently, I have an operation that teaches MBAs who come here from America. Now I'm going to expand in scope and have a program that takes people who already have MBAs and takes them for another year in a MAM program. And we would call that a program scope. The Lincoln Center was a program scope expansion. And the standard argument for those things is that, well, there's another set of programs that I can do better because they fit well with the organizational structure that I have, and the talents and the assets and the people and maybe even the facilities that I have lend themselves well to doing another piece of an operation. And on the demand side, that there's something about the mission that says doing these things would be a good idea. So for example, in the Lincoln Center example, one of the reasons they moved into jazz was that they had, their mission was to do all of the classic arts. And at some point, some of the more forthcoming and progressive board members said, jazz is actually a classic art too. And we've taken a very narrow perspective on what constitutes the arts and convinced the leadership of Lincoln Center to move into jazz as well, similarly with film. So those represent scope expansions that are done because people thought the mission requires me to do some things differently, new things, and those new things would fit well with what I'm doing already. Those are, again, demand side things, and they begin with again, there's need out there, and I can do it, and it's my mission to do these things. Then, of course, there are cost reasons people expand. So if you think in the private sector, very often when you ask management, why is it you want to expand, they say something, if it's a scale expansion, they say something about economies of scale. So they say, I already have a CEO and a CFO, and I only make 3 widgets. If I made 7 widgets, I could still keep just the same CEO and the CFO, and I would be able to lower my average cost of production. In the scope expansions, usually the cost story is a little less compelling because you've got to argue there's something about producing that second object, which is quite different from the first, that gives you some kind of cost advantage. But I could go back to our MAM program, which some of you may know about, and say I think one of the arguments for the MAM program was that with extra seats in some of the elective courses, we could have a program that just took people who were going to do those second-level elective courses, and that would both enrich the program, so would be good on the demand side, but would also give us some scope economies on the cost side. So cost side things and demand side things. And then there are, of course, the things that just say, I'm a guy, I'm a woman, I'm running something, I'm doing it great, I'd like it to be bigger. And almost a kind of non-reflective growth demand. And I was interested in my nonprofit class this year. I had as a guest a young man, very able young man who graduated a couple of years ago, and he's just starting a charter school in Queens. And he came and talked to the class about what it takes. He had gotten his charter, and he's now busy trying to hire teachers and do all kinds of things in anticipation of an opening next September. And he finished his pitch, and it was really quite inspiring. And this first question, a young man raised his hand and said, well, where are you going to open the next one? And I thought he hadn't even opened the first one yet. And you were already thinking about his growth path involving incremental schools. And I think that's a very, very human thing, and it's something I think I want to warn you against, because it's going to be very easy to tell yourself that what's driving you is on the demand, or in particular on the cost side, but really what's driving you is some inexorable human interest in doing something new for a scope growth or something bigger for a scale growth. And in particular, I want you to worry about it because it's a very interesting thing that in most for-profit companies, manufacturing companies, the kinds of things we teach, some of you I taught economics about, the cost curve of firms for production, even though the textbooks sometimes draw it U-shaped, actually, if you have average costs and quantity, mostly looks kind of like that. That is, it gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper for you to produce it, however big you get, and it never gets more expensive. Okay, sometimes it doesn't get cheaper at a faster rate. You're as efficient as you're going to be, but you stay at that level of efficiency, even though what happened to my, okay, there you go. But you stay at that level of efficiency even if you grow. It turns out, for many, many nonprofits, that's not really what the cost curve looks like. The cost curve much more often is actually a classic U-shape, given the nature of production in this area. And in other words, when you get, it is possible that instead of growth bringing you cost efficiencies, you will find yourself with higher costs, at least, or, thought of another way, higher cost if you want to produce the same quality that you produced before. And I think an excellent example of this is education. And if we think about education, we used to think, the early days of the 40s and the 50s, if you looked at the schools, say a school built in New York, they were very, very large. And they were very large for cost-driven reasons. People thought, okay, I need a gym. And for kids to do anything, the gym's got to be pretty big. And really then, if the gym's that big, I could have a lot more kids using the gym. I need a library and a librarian, so I don't want to just have 100 kids. I might as well have 1,000 kids, because I have a lot of things that are fixed costs, and I can spread them over all these kids. And it actually turns out, if what you're measuring is the number of children who are in school every year in this building, it is cheaper to have a very big number of kids in that school. The problem is they don't learn very well. So if we were measuring output in learning units, we would discover once the class gets too big, the cost of getting good learning units gets very high. Because in many situations in the nonprofit area, actually small is beautiful because it is a service delivery system. And because it depends on relationships among people and community kinds of things, when it gets too big on a scale size, you may have problems in actually keeping your quality up. And then you're faced either with higher costs in order to get the quality up, or just letting the quality be down and telling people what you're measuring is the throughput through your school. And forgetting that throughput through the school is not really very good if those children aren't learning anything in the school. So growth is not always bad. Sometimes growth, it is great to move down this curve, and sometimes there's a flat part in the middle, and it's good to move along it. But I just begin my warning with, think a little bit about whether the cost curve is going to go up, especially around questions about the quality of what it is you're producing, and not just the fact that you can spread the fixed costs over more and more units. Scope economies, adding more programs has, of course, the same problem, which is people get a little less focused. And I think actually nonprofits have become a little more sophisticated about the problem of adding yet another program, and have begun to move back a little bit, in my experience, from the let's have yet another program, in recognition that the executive director and the staff then just find themselves not knowing if it's Monday or Tuesday, or what part of the operation they're supposed to be in. So it is useful, and this is useful, my sort of big takeaway for you today, and I'm going to have more takeaways, but this to me is a big one. The impulse to do what you're doing to more people in more different settings is not only a very human impulse, but it is a socially valuable impulse, because it really comes from the desire so much of our students, many of other people's students, who want to do good in the world, and recognizing they're doing something good, they want to do it more. But you can do good in your way. You can spread your ideas, not just grow your organization. So that much of the way you actually spread the way you do things comes from telling other people how to do it well. And for me, a classic example of this is teaching. So it turns out most faculty share their materials with other people. And why do they do that? They do that because they're so pleased that they know they've really figured out how to teach MBAs something or other, or fourth graders something or other. And so what do? They have a friend who teaches it across the country or someplace else, and they say, how do I teach these people? And you do it this way. You want my notes? Here are my notes. Do you want my materials? Here are my materials. Here's a video of me doing it so you can figure out how to do it. Lots of sharing of ideas. And that works very well because there isn't so much competition in getting clients across those disparate geographic areas, and because it is a way for an individual to increase influence across a wide geographic area. And I think that works for many more nonprofits than you think, that sometimes it is spreading your ideas that is going to give you the kind of growth that will really be helpful to you. Some of the charter schools, Daisha Toll, who runs the Achievement First Network, said that they have people in the school whose job it is to answer the phone and counsel and give advice to people who want to start charter schools of their own. Now, they do a lot of expansion also, and I'll talk a little bit about their expansion and why they expand. But they also have someone who says, here's a person in the organization whose job it is to help other people build institutions and build units and spread our ideas. We don't have to do it all ourselves. And I think that urge to do it all ourselves is something people should resist. So let's suppose, though, you've decided you are going to grow. So let's think a little bit about how do we grow if we are going to grow. On the program scope question, I would say that the question you want to ask yourself if you're going to do another program is centrally, do I do it myself or do I partner with others? So if you wanted to move, if you were a performing arts organization and you decided you wanted to have a wine bar next door to you for your people to come and use, do you do it yourself or do you actually hire an outside caterer who comes in and runs the wine bar? Because after all, he probably knows about running a wine bar and you don't. So there are many of those situations in which you just work with a partner. When Yale decided to go into Singapore, which was actually a mission-driven expansion, not a cost-driven expansion, I think President Levin believed that Asia needed to learn something about what an American liberal arts college looked like. And he was determined to go over there and help them learn that. But he didn't do it by himself. He didn't go over and decide to set up a new, Yale all by himself. He chose a partner, NUS. And I think that was a wise move because there's a lot he didn't know about Singapore, even though he knew a lot about liberal arts education. Many, many times we will see organizations starting something out by themselves, realizing they can't do it, and moving to get a partner. I would urge, again, if you're going to do scope expansions, you to think hard about partnership from an early day, because that helps us with the diseconomies of scope associated with losing focus if you actually have a partner. But I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about scale expansions, because I think that's mostly what people get engaged with. Now, it turns out that when I say organizations are going to expand, most of those expansions are going to happen by setting up new sites for their operations. And that's because most of what you're doing as a nonprofit is service provision that involves, if you will, on-site production. So if I am running a hospital, mostly what I'm doing is people come to my hospital in New Haven and I fix them. And Cleveland Clinic actually has some people flying in, but mostly the model is you serve the catchment area in your neighborhood. Same thing with an education, with a school. Most schools, unless they're boarding schools, serve a catchment area within their community. Planned Parenthood, if you need family services and you are in Texas, you want to get them in Texas, you don't want to come to New Haven for them. So when I think about expanding and I have a services business, the expansion is going to be setting up multiple sites. So you're imagining a situation which I have grown my school, my hospital, my opera house, my whatever it is, my Habitat for Humanity, my Planned Parenthood. I've grown to the right scale to serve my area. And now my question is, I do this well here. Should I set one up in Cleveland, in Dallas, in Buffalo, New York? Or do I just continue doing what I'm doing here well in New Haven? How do we think about geographic expansions? Come back to that in a minute. So one of the things, again, I take you back to your early econ class. When you think about scale expansions, the kinds of things mostly people think about are, I've got a assembly line of cars, and I can just make the assembly line longer and faster, and now I can lower the average cost. I get that average cost down because I've got big machines and I can make the machines bigger. And in fact, there's things we tell our class about, the the volume pass-through of the machine grows faster than the perimeter or some crazy engineering-ish sort of thing. And that's the source of my scale economies. But in the nonprofit sector, the kind of scale expansion you're having is multi-site. It's not getting more in one site. So it's not that I'm using the existing facility better. I actually have to do a new facility in new places. And that's going to create some issues for me. One issue is going to be the source of the economies of scale is going to be very different from what we think of as a source of economies of scale in the single unit operation. Because I'm having multi-units, it's not like I have a machine that can go faster or even a building that can hold more kids. I'm going to have two buildings and 2 machines for this operation. So we are going to look at what we would call an industrial organization. We're going to look for scale effects not at the plant level, which we think of as the site level for nonprofits, but at the firm level, at the organizational level. Now, what kinds of things would give us economies of scale at the firm level? Well, the standard things that do that for the for-profit are bargaining power around inputs. So let's think Walmart. Walmart is powerful, has multi-sites. Each of those sites is reasonably sized, but its real size comes from how many of those stores it has. And the strength of having more stores is you are a bigger bargainer against Procter & Gamble and all of the large manufacturers of the goods you want to carry, and you can get a better price. So bargaining power with your suppliers is a common source of economies of scale at the site level. But that's not going to work for most nonprofits. The only thing that they use pretty much are people. And it's never going to be the case that you are an enormous force in the bidding market for your labor. And in any case, if you said to a nonprofit manager, your biggest advantage is you get to pay people low wages, that is not going to really feel like a very attractive competitive advantage to you. A second source is R&D and know-how. And a third source is some kind of IT-ish advantages. And in those 2 places, we do see some source for economies of scale, depending on what it is you're doing. So, for example, the charter schools have decided that they want to be multi-site because it costs money to do the data monitoring and the curriculum development. And that once you've done the data monitoring systems and the oversight of curriculum stuff, you can then roll it out to multiple sites. And there's some scale economies in that. So that's a reason you might have multi-sites in the charter areas. But it's not going to work in many other kinds of areas, because many kinds of areas don't have that particular feature of something that scales up in multi-sites. So I think you need to think pretty hard if you're going to be thinking about scale economies in whether or not there really are some scale economies, recognizing that real scale economies mean I put in 3 sites and the sum of the cost of the 3 sites is less than it would be if 3 different people ran those sites. Sometimes the answer is it's not. And so that's a thing I want you to think about. All right, so if suppose you've still decided there are some reasons you want to do expansions, you're going to do multi-site. Then you have some questions about how do you do the multi-site. And here the question is, there are lots of different ways you can do multi-site, and I want to think about the stuff on the right-hand side. So as I said, if you want to grow, you can just give other people your idea, or you could license your idea, okay, if you want a little revenue from it, and people do that as well. But true expansions and true replication normally comes from using one of the 2 end pieces, that I can establish a branch office or I could establish a franchise. So in my opening example, the Human Rights Watch, that's a branch office model. Oxfam, Mercy Corps, those are branch office models. And by that we simply mean the center controls the flow of money. It sends money to the branches do whatever they're going to do. The fundraising can be shared between branch and central, But the money goes back to the central, and the central allocates it across the branches, and the people that work in the branches work for the center. That's a classic model, and that model has the advantages it gives you a lot of control. Okay? I can tell people what to do. I can say, Walter, you know, I want you to do your menu this way, and I want you to treat the kids this way, and da-da-da-da-da, and I can come and check it out, and there it is. It has very good properties in terms of control. It has other properties that are not so helpful. And in particular, the standard property that's not so helpful, that is especially relevant in the nonprofit area, is that if you want to have the kind of good behavior we hope to have for our managers, and you want to have a lot of growth, you're going to need a lot of these branch offices. And if you have an awful lot of these branch offices, it's not going to be easy to monitor them. And it's not going to be easy to make sure the managers are doing what you want them to do or doing things in a creative and interesting way. So if you only have a few of them, you can get the tight control and monitoring. But if you actually want to grow pretty fast, then it's going to be more helpful for you to have something that looks more like a McDonald's or a franchise. And you will see in most of, and I've done some work on this, most of the big nonprofits that we know are franchise systems. And let's just give you an example of how that works. Habitat for Humanity is a franchise operation. If you want to be a Habitat for Humanity in New Haven, you contact the people that are in the central Habitat for Humanity operation, and you say, I would like to be a Habitat for Humanity. They check you out and make sure you have a reasonable plan. And that reasonable plan needs to include local donors. It needs to include local connections with the government people who are going to be watching the way you're building. And it has to include some understanding and some need for the habitat type operation in your area. If you can convince them you will be good, they will bring you down. And they will train you up a little bit in the Habitat for Humanity's ways, and then you will come back to New Haven. And while you're back in New Haven, you will be responsible for the bottom line. So you'll be responsible for raising your own money for the Habitat for Humanity, and you'll be responsible for having all the costs of your Habitat for Humanity. And if it turns out you can't make it work, then they will say, sayonara. What you get from them is early advice, you get some training, you get some rules about ways to do things, because if you want to call yourself a Habitat for Humanity, you got to do some things their way, and you get a piece of their reputation because you've gotten their name. And for that, you're going to have to pay them something, and the payment arrangements are all over the map, but the money flow is typically from the franchisee to the mother country. And that model allowed places like Habitat for Humanity to grow very rapidly. And it meant that the local Habitat for Humanities had a lot of incentives to raise money and to watch out for costs, because it was their future that was going to really be determined by whether or not they could raise money and manage costs. So they had what we call in economics very high-powered incentives to do a good job. If they had new ideas, they brought them back to the center, and there could be a lab that then allowed you to do some trading across different sites, because we were allowing these sites to have a little bit of independence, unlike the branch offices. So we loosen control and create kind of a lab. We don't want to loosen it that much, because if we loosen it too much, goodness knows what they'll do, and then people will say, boy, that's a terrible Habitat for Humanity. Maybe they're all terrible. So I've got to have some kind of control, but I don't have a huge amount of control. Franchise seems to be the preferred way for most nonprofit organizations doing site expansions beyond their own territory to do this. And just as an example, you can have looser or tighter franchise monitoring. So a good contrast is between, in the education area, is between the KIP model, knowledge is power, very big networked charter school, and the Achievement First model. The Achievement First model, I was on one of the Achievement First boards, and this is an example I used that initially took people aback, but actually I think it works pretty well as an analogy. Achievement First is like Walmart, and KIPP is like IKEA. And that's because their replications worked in the following way. IKEA, when they came to this country, began in, I think, someplace in Pennsylvania, and then they went to New York, and then they went to California, and then they went someplace over there, and then they went someplace over there. IKEA was following the profit opportunities. IKEA was looking at markets and saying, I see in these areas there are the kind of people who would like IKEA furniture and there's no competition. They were making location choices on the demand side. Walmart was making expansion decisions looking at costs. They began in Arkansas and they spread from around Arkansas. And then they spread, and it's a wonderful, there's an economist who does a map of this, and it just gets started and then it grows out like some kind of a mythical beast. But their play was a cost play, and the way to maintain cost and control was to start in the center and then add things and then just add warehouses and more things around them. You get a cost play. For Achievement First, all their expansion has been from New Haven out. And in fact, they have described themselves as limiting their site expansion to any place you can use the train, not the plane. And why is that? It's because they want tighter control over quality. The KIPP people have decided they are willing to have some schools started and have them fail. And so they go to the places where they think are the biggest needs, and they're willing to take a crapshoot that it'll work. And they provide some help and some curriculum, and they certainly do some good work, and they actually have quite a good set of operations, but they also have failures. And they do that because they think it's worth a risk if I have places that really desperately need some kind of improvement in their education. Achievement First has decided they don't want to take any risks. So their expansion is happening very close to the mothership so that the mothership can carefully watch what's going on, because her audacious belief is that if we have a failure, it threatens the mothership. And KIPP has decided that we can afford a few failures and the mothership will be fine. But they're very different expansion motives, and the KIPP expansion motive gets you much broader, much faster, many more schools. And more control, closer to branch office, a little less like franchise, gets you slower expansion, much more control over it. That's a decision you need to make if you're doing that kind of an expansion. How much risk are you willing to take? How much control do you need? How clear is the design? Because if it's very true that the way in which you're going to run something is really specific and really can be written down and can be done very carefully, then it could be you can expand it much more rapidly and much broader. But if it's a little touchy-feely, which many nonprofit organizations are, then you may worry about doing that kind of rapid expansion. Okay, so again, we did this. What does the franchise do? Key issue is how do you control the organization, and how do you make sure you have some control over what they're doing while at the same time you let a little bit of innovation in order to develop what you want to do. I don't need to do that. Okay. So what are the advantages of doing it all yourself in a branch office versus trying to bring other people in as franchisees? A couple of things. Franchisees gives much stronger incentives to the local managers and allows you to grow much faster. Branch office gives you much more control. You go much slower, but it gets you a lot of ability to do coordination. So a classic problem with the franchise model is one that became clear in the National Public Radio system. National Public Radio is also a kind of franchise operation. And when National Public Radio, when the stations were separated technologically, because all sites only got one national radio station, then they didn't need to coordinate on fundraising. Whoever you listened to, whenever they wanted to, did some kind of appeal, like, you're listening to the radio, why aren't you sending me a check? And that was fine. But if it turned out when technology expanded, then we have stations, areas in which you can get multiple stations. And now you're going to be hit by multiple stations' donor calls. Didn't I just finish donor call? Now it's again, the next month I get the donor call from the other guy. In that setting, because we were using the franchise, we had to have much more than control over what each of the organizations did because natural barriers broke down. In places where there are natural barriers and you can have territorial restrictions, you can have franchises and you don't have to worry about coordinating. In places in which they overlap, then you've got coordination problems, and then you're better off doing something that's a more controlled kind of structure. Again, depends a little bit on what you're doing. I like the example of these, some of these health organizations like American Lung Societies, which are also franchise operations. They have very interesting rules on fundraising as attempts to coordinate, and this is not an uncommon method. Anything you do locally, because they have territories, so if you're doing something in New Haven, if it involves something physical you're doing locally, like a walk-a-thon or a gala or something of that sort, and you raise money for it, they don't tax you on it. Anytime you do anything like email, letter, anything of that sort, they get a part of the revenue stream from it. And one of the things that does, from an economist's point of view, it's like putting a tax on that kind of activity. And so it tilts organizations in favor of doing things that are local in nature and away from doing things that potentially have a broader overlapping kind of an audience because the national wants to control how that operation is done. So there are ways you can control what the sites do, but it gets tricky if you get too big. So those of you that have in mind taking your nonprofits and having 52 affiliates like Planned Parenthood does should be forewarned that this takes a lot of coordination and that going the franchise way, which is my favorite way to go, involves also some losing control. In the Planned Parenthood, for example, because it is a franchise, years ago it was moving into a program scope expansion and it decided it was going to make condoms. And it thought condoms, that seemed like the sort of thing that was very consistent with Planned Parenthood's mission. Right? And they wanted them to be sold at the different affiliates. They were going to have a little, whatever stand at the affiliates at which they sold condoms. The affiliates didn't want to sell condoms. They were happy to give them away. They thought that was great. But people came in, they didn't want to start upselling them onto condoms. Okay? They came for family planning, and that's what they were going to get. We weren't going to engage in that kind of thing. Planned Parenthood couldn't get it off the ground. They eventually, and I had a student years later who said her job for the summer was taking the excess condoms and distributing them in Latin America because they couldn't sell the stuff because you don't have as much control over your franchisees as you have over central control. So going that way, again, gives you a lot of advantages, but it doesn't give you all the advantages that you have when you're really running things all by yourself. I was told I was supposed to leave 15 minutes for you. So let me, just one last thing. Where do I see these franchises? If I need a lot of permanent sites, I'm going to go franchise rather than branch office. So for example, Mercy Corps and Save the Children, those are branch offices because they're not really providing direct service in that way. They send teams out to places, but they don't have a little, you don't need to be raising money on the ground every little place in that way. Planned Parenthood, again, franchise because it has many offices. If I need local cooperation and adaptation in fundraising, that's going to push me. If it's local fundraising that I'm going to do, it's going to push me towards a franchise because I need that local energy. If it's central coordination, it's going to push me branch office. And finally, the more that real managerial effort and imagination is important, the less attractive it's going to be to send people out in branch offices, which has a tendency to to really suppress people's incentives to be creative and work hard. And for that, we tend to think franchises work better. So my message to all of you is, A, think hard about whether the growth you want really makes sense. That lesson one is there are ways you can help the world by helping other people start organizations that borrow from your own but are more well-suited to what it is they're doing, either in where they're doing it or what they're doing. Doesn't mean you should never grow, but think hard about whether there really are mission reasons or cost-side reasons that drive you in favor of doing some kind of expansion, or whether it's really just your own interest in doing something nifty and new in the next year, because we all know in the nonprofit area, resources are scarce, and our job is really to use them well. And doing something that's essentially a vanity play is a hard thing, I think, hard thing to do when resources are so scarce for the real work that needs to be done. If you are going to expand, think if you're expanding scope on using partners. I think partnerships are underused in the nonprofit area and can be very productive in terms of helping you do something new. If you're going a scale expansion, I would think for most organizations, once you move beyond your immediate area, okay, once you start moving into other states or other counties, that some kind of franchise-like operation is going to work best for most organizations. And then your job is to just think about, how do I get that nice balance between freedom to think and innovate for the people running these franchises and control of my reputation on the other. Okay, I was told to finish at 6:45, so are there questions from outside or from the audience?
And if you can just hold down your microphone, so for the benefit of those who are listening from outside the room. Thank you.
Paul.
So, Sharon, I was late for class, not the first time, and you may have covered this, and perhaps it's slightly off topic, but I was thinking as you were talking about Easter seals and how whenever they expanded, and I don't know actually if they're franchised or centralized, but they would be paired with a Goodwill thrift store, both for the purpose of making money and also for the purpose of employing the developmentally disabled people they serve. And likewise, I think when the Newman's Own Foundation was started, it was primarily dedicated to raising funds for Hole in the Wall Gang Camp, and then it became so successful, it began to serve other nonprofits. So I'm just curious as to how the sort of new generation of social enterprises, some of which that are connected to nonprofits directly, are influencing the expansion of those, the growth of those nonprofits.
So I would say it is a little far afield, but I'll say a little bit about it. It is true that more of the nonprofits that we see now look a little more hybrid than they did early on, by which I mean they don't just take donative funds and deliver great services free to people. Some of what they do is they charge some of the people sometimes for what they're doing. And they might, do value of service pricing, charge people different amounts depending on who they are. But there's much more attention to earned income because donative income has gotten harder and harder to raise. So more and more of them are thinking of earned income. And in those thinking about earned income, they very often start with partners because they know they don't really know what they're doing. But not always. Like Greystone, for example, runs bakeries, and that's definitely an earned income venture. Most of their funds come from the bakeries, not from donations. And that seems to work well for them. But I would say the modern nonprofit tends to be relying a little more on trying to get money by earning it rather than just raising it. I thought you were going to ask me about Easter Seals because it's also an organization that was started for parts of the things it was starting to do, like March of Dimes, were solved, and they broadened what it was their kind of their thing was in a very interesting scope expansion way. Anyone else? Yeah, Harry, Emery.
I believe in studying or learning from failures. Are there examples that you can point to where a nonprofit tried to expand and then completely flopped, and why?
So in the arts organizations, failures are almost always preceded by organizations buying a building. And the answer to why is actually very simple from an economics point of view. These are organizations have quite volatile revenue streams, okay, both on the donor side and on the sometimes the plays are good and sometimes they aren't, sometimes the music's good, sometimes it isn't. So renting makes perfect sense because I can move around to a smaller place if I have to and so on. You buy a big building, you got a big mortgage, now you're stuck. And you're matching a fixed high cost stream with a volatile revenue stream. That's a kind of disaster. And it's, interestingly, mergers are infrequent in the nonprofit area, but the places we see the most are when one of them has just bought a building and is now failing. And then someone else takes them over because they decide the two of them could use the building actually better. So that's a failure in that setting. You know, there's an argument by Henry Hansman who calls capital in the nonprofit sector trapped capital, and says that we actually see way less failure, and the evidence suggests statistically that failure rates for nonprofits exits are much less than they are in the for-profit world. And that is because many nonprofits have some faithful donor who, even as terrible things happen to the organization, maybe of their own making, maybe not, will reach deep in and pony up some money. And Hansman argues that actually the field would be better off if more were left to fail, because in not failing, they take donors and resources from organizations that are maybe run better. So Hansman, who has a lot of contrarian ideas in the nonprofit area, but nevertheless interesting ones, complains about, as I said, trapped capital in hospitals, in arts organizations, in a range of areas. So too many are perhaps not enough are failing, Henry. Yeah, Jennifer.
Yeah, so on that same note, we spoke in your nonprofit class at SOM when I was a student here about how there's also not the same numbers of mergers and acquisitions in a nonprofit sector as there are in for-profit. And I was wondering where you think that comes from, like for those of us involved in nonprofits, how can you be prepared to see when that opportunity exists and would be beneficial for both organizations? Mm-hmm. And so, you know, why doesn't that process happen, and how could we make it happen when appropriate?
So I think there are a few reasons. You know, there is what many people call excess differentiation in the nonprofit sector, which is part of the no mergers, coming from the fact that everyone that starts a new organization says the reason, so let me just pick on my wonderful charter school guy, who decided he was going to set up his own charter school his own way, even though, you know, Achievement First and others said, you know, you're a great guy, you could start one of ours in that neighborhood. No, mine is going to be better and different in these following centrally important ways, and that's why I'm doing it myself. Now, he's a lovely guy. I think he's going to maybe succeed. We'll see. But again, in the human tendencies, the tendency to think my idea is a lot different from your idea and a lot better than your idea means that we have a lot of differentiation. And when we think about merging, the problem is we see, well, you look a lot different from me. And if we merge, I'm going to have to give up something about the way I do things and take on something about the way you do things. And so when we see them again, they're usually at the very last moment of someone's gasping for breath and decides merger would be better than losing out completely. But, you know, you can look, I'm a big opera fan, and it turns out, I guess I'm the only one, because operas are really on hard times these days. And many, many of them have dropped off. We lost one in Chicago. New York City Opera is just a shadow of its former self. Boston lost one of its opera companies. And they could have merged sooner, and they just didn't. And by the time it was possible, they knew that it was curtains for them, there was nothing left for anyone to want.
We have union contracts that require them to do a certain number of services that make it difficult for them to merge.
I agree. I agree. I agree. We have a merger happening at the moment with the Divinity School. Divinity School is taking over, probably, they're close to it, another seminary that is dying someplace in Massachusetts, I guess. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Asta. I'm a second year MBA student here. My name is Glover, and I was working in the impact investing fund before coming to SOM. And at that time, one of the most important criteria of our investment principle is looking at the scalability of the social enterprise. I feel it's kind of encourage organizations to expand. Do you think this is a good idea to?
So I know that that is true for the social impact funds, and it's a sensible thing for them to do, because if you think about investing money, there's a fixed cost in investigating whether the idea is any good, and then you only get that back because it's big enough to pay you an interest rate that gets it back to you. So it's not worth the investigation funds or the investigation costs to invest in things that are not scalable and not going to get big enough. So I would say it's not a mistake. I would say that their sweet spot is the kinds of organizations that should be large and should be scaled up. And for organizations that should be large and should be scaled up, I think Planned Parenthood makes a lot of sense. Habitat for Humanity, those make a lot of sense being networked. I think the charter schools make a lot of sense being networked. A lot of other kinds of things don't make any sense doing it that way. So I would just say those kinds of social impact investors, investment funds, the Acumens, the Echoing Green, all those things are really, they're really going to focus on the bigger scale or the potentially bigger scale operation.
We have a few questions coming in from the audience listening in at home. Lee Feldman, class of 1980, asks, are there cases where growth is driven by the perceived need to attract new funding, get existing donors excited, or create programs that fit guidelines for new sources of funding?
Yeah. So a lot of the scope stuff, which I didn't talk too much about, is really driven by foundations and donors. And I'm sure all of you have run nonprofits, have exactly this experience of a donor who comes to you and says, I like what you're doing, you know, that's pretty, but really what I'd like is you to do this thing. And, you know, if you'll do that, I'll give you another 50 grand. And, you know, you think, well, that's something that's not ridiculous. You know, it's kind of sort of in the mission, because fortunately most of you have very broad missions. So many things would fit in those broad missions. And you're sort of confident about your abilities to do things. So you think I could do that. So, you know, donor-driven program expansion is very common. And in fact, there's a general rule as you look at nonprofits that as you think about nonprofits growing themselves, there are levels on which they should grow. They should grow in administrative structure. They should grow in financial wisdom. They should grow in the kind of sophistication of the boards. And they can grow in programs. And when you line things up, what you'll observe is the program growth is just galloping. And the growth in the systems to support the program growth is, you know, is taking eeny-beeny baby steps in that direction. So not only do you get pushed to grow too much on the program side, no one wants to fund the G&A that would be required to actually manage multiple programs inside your organization. So I do agree it's an issue. And you have to, the ability to resist a check to do something you don't really want to do that much, that may well cost you in the end more, is something that should be a prerequisite for an executive director. Anyone else? Yeah, please.
Another question from the audience. Can you elaborate on ways to guard against decreased quality of services or outcomes when expanding and when quality is dependent on human service provision and or leadership?
Yeah, so, you know, the difficult feature of nonprofits is most production is essentially labor production. You know, one of the ways that manufacturing gets standardization and business gets standardization is it doesn't involve that many people. And if it doesn't involve that many people, you can get the same set of things over and over and over again. But that is just not true for nonprofits. It involves fundamentally, almost everything you can imagine doing involves people. And so the only way to get standardization enough to maintain quality is to do a lot of training, a lot of, if you're big, rotating people in to the center and out again, to do conferences with the people at the various sites so they can share knowledge and develop kind of a common culture. It's all got to be done through the people, and that's an expensive and difficult way to do it, but I would say it's really the only way that works. Otherwise, you have a bunch of people out there doing different quality things that you're not in control of. Anyone else from Kim?
Sort of on that note, the cost quality trade-off that you talked about, or the curve, I'm thinking about maybe this is a KIPP example where you're willing to forego some quality in order to serve more people. And so if you're making the calculus that your mission really is about serving the greatest number, that you're willing to make that trade-off. And I wonder if you can just do that.
I agree with that, and I would say this problem arises when industries begin. It is most prominent when industries begin. So the charter school example is a great one in that sense. When charter schools began, there were not many charter systems around, and so you were really breaking new territory. And the view, I think, was there was so much bad education, we might as well go in and produce mediocre education because it's better than bad. But as the movement increases and as the number of competitors increase, the tolerance for mediocre goes down. And again, this is exactly true in the for-profit sector. When there's a new industry opening, a lot of times the players are pretty inefficient because the main thing is they got something new and it does well against the other industry it was competing with, and you can get away with a lot. But as your industry gets more mature and new entry happens, you can't get away with so much. And by then you may have gotten a reputation that is hard to shake, because that's a central asset of your nonprofit, is your reputation. You want to be really careful. And I'm not demeaning KIPP. I think actually KIPP runs a great operation. But I think that is the challenge for you, is to make sure that you don't do things at the beginning that you can get away with because there's not much competition there, and it gets you out there fast, and it's important you to get out there fast. But you're going to have to think about the end game too, that your reputation, the reputation you set up in that early days, is going to be increasingly valuable as you get older.
And can I piggyback on that? Because you talked at the beginning about the other idea of just sharing ideas. Like you don't have to replicate, but you can share ideas. And then I guess I want to ask you about quality there too, because there's lots of bad ideas in education, just to use that example. So how do you take what you're saying is, I want to spread my ideas, I want to share my knowledge, I want to disseminate this practice, but
so the ideas don't come with your name on it. So that, in that sense, there's less reputation risk. But there is also much less control. So, and that's why people don't want to just share their ideas, because they think, I can tell you, but you're never going to do it as well as I do. And that is probably true for many things. Ideas that are, again, a little more specific, you do better in. Ideas that are really design rigid. So I have a example. I do a case in my micro class called The Glass Factory. And some of you have done that with me, even old alums. Been doing it for years. It's a great example. And when my daughter started teaching micro at Chicago Booth, I gave it to her, and she does it. And then when she gave it to one of her colleagues, he's now doing it at Kellogg. And then some other colleague, he's now doing it at Stanford, But it's a very clear, narrow kind of thing. Works beautifully for everybody, okay? But I have a lot of ideas. I gave her a lot of ideas, too. Those ideas didn't quite duplicate themselves in quite the same way. So something that's narrow and specific and sort of written down, the architecture or the blueprint is clearer, are ideas that are easy to share. Things that are about art rather than science, if you will, are things in which you can tell people, and you'll get some variant on that art, and hopefully that's better than what they're doing now, but it's not going to be exactly what you do. Yeah, Paul.
Question. You alluded to partnering earlier, and so my mind went to thinking about the regional theater movement and how independent regional theaters who never would partner with other theaters are now doing that. So you'll see and even in the same market, like you'll see Longmore Theater partnering with the Hartford Stage to do a production and sharing any residuals down the road, but the main thing is saving costs, I think. And so I'm just curious as to whether partnering between independent nonprofits has been a way for them to expand their efforts and save money as well.
So the interesting piece of that is the nonprofits are in exactly the same industry. And that's more unusual than partnering with someone who's a nonprofit or a for-profit in an adjacent industry. There's lots of cooperation in the theater business between the for-profit and nonprofit. So most of what we see in the, I don't remember the numbers, but well over half of what we see at Broadway began at some nonprofit theater, and they get residuals for it. It includes things like Hamilton, for example. And there's lots of reasons, which we don't have to go into, that there's some real advantages in starting in the nonprofit. It's much cheaper to start that way, in part for union reasons, and then move into the big thing if it turns out it's good. And there's payments by the for-profit to the nonprofit for doing that. Examples of regional theaters themselves cooperating, I have fewer examples of. I know Seattle used to do more of that. That was a stage for Seattle that was preparatory to some of the theaters going out of business. Okay, so, I mean, and I don't think it contributed. I think there was some stress in the business model that led to some cooperation that you might not have seen before, and then eventually they faded. So I don't want to say that that's true here too, but I think a lot of what we see as new ideas of cooperating and doing things comes because things aren't so hunky-dory the way they have been all along.
So
Yeah.
I think this has to be the last question. Thank you.
Molly?
If anyone else has a burning last question, I'm happy to yield the floor.
Molly's had my course recently, so she hasn't forgotten everything.
I also live around the block, so I could ask another time. All right. So I've had the opportunity to see nonprofits in different cities that are doing really exciting, often innovative work, and wish that people had this mindset of, I want to spread my model more often. And I feel like, most local nonprofits stay local. Maybe there's some mentoring that takes place at conference, peer mentoring or exchange of ideas that takes place at, professional conferences. But I'm wondering, this is a sort of a big one for the last question. I'm wondering if you could speak to how can either academics or nonprofit leaders or people in the social enterprise space like I am, how can we work together to change the mindset of people working at the local level to try to try to replicate their model, whether that's through spreading their ideas or curriculum or actually, doing the franchise model. I think it helps when nonprofit people go to business school, for instance. But how do you spread this idea that actually you have a great idea, you need to bring it to other cities because it would really help the same population there?
Yeah, and you can, in fact, teach the people that are doing it in a slightly different way in other places and spread. Mostly those big spreads happen because either a big donor decides he or she wants to put money behind it, or because there's some media attention to the good work that's going on at the local level. They put you on Oprah, and all of a sudden you have new opportunities to spread and do things. The reason a lot of small nonprofits don't take their ideas elsewhere is things are tight. And it's hard to get the money to do what you're doing in your own local area. And so it's a hard way to end, but even in the nonprofits, it's often about the money. And I would say, as my last pitch is, if we're all going to get a tax cut in this next administration, there is a way in which we should all dedicate our tax cuts to social value and social good of the sort you're all going to be doing. Okay, thank you all.
thank you all for joining us. There is a reception, so you will have an opportunity to ask Professor Oster more burning questions if you have them.
Find out what we've all been doing.
Yes. But thank you again. This was wonderful.